We're going to look at multiplying and dividing integers. I want to start off with reviewing what the definition of multiplication really means. So I've started with an example, 2 times 5. What does it mean? I can look at it two different ways. I can say that I have 2 5s, 5, 2 times. So I have 2 5s, which would be like 5 plus 5, which is going to give me 10. Or I can look at it the reverse. I can say I have 5 2s. I have a 2 5 times. So 5 2s would be adding up 5 2s. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I still get 10. So this is the basic premise of why 5 times 2 is 10. Or 2 times 5. Doesn't matter which way you multiply. So let's take a look if we start viewing multiplication with integers. What if I have 2 times negative 5? What does this mean? Well, this means I have a negative 5 2 times. So I have 2 negative 5s. A negative 5 and a negative 5. 2 negative 5s would give me a negative 10. Okay, so notice my 2 times 5 is still the same. I get the 10, but the negative was with the 5. I get a negative with my answer. And we'll go into more detail on that in a minute. So here's some more examples. What if I have 3 times negative 4? That means I have a negative 4 3 times. That's one way I could look at it. So I have a negative 4, a negative 4, and a negative 4. That's a total of negative 12. So 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. What if I have 5 times negative 1? I have a negative 1 5 times. So 5 negative 1s, that gives me a total of negative 5. Negative 2 times 6. I have negative 2, and I have it 6 times. That's one way I could look at it. So I have 6 negative 2s, which gives me a total of negative 12. And notice, every time I'm getting the answer, I'm just multiplying the two numbers as I previously have in the past, but I'm taking that negative sign with my answer. 3 times 4 is 12. A negative gives me a negative answer. 5 times 1 is 5. A negative in the problem gives me a negative answer, and so on. So let's try some. Negative 8 times 4. 8 times 4 is 32, but those 8s were all negative. So I have 4 negative 8s. So I'm going to get a total of negative 32. Number 2, 5 times 3 is 15. I have 5 negative 3s. So all these negative 3s adding up are going to give me negative 15. I bring the negative with it. 1 times 11 is 11. My 1s were all negative. So I'm going to have a negative answer, negative 11. 7 times 6 is 42. But I had 7 of these negative 6s. All these negative 6s are going to add up to give me a negative 42. So I multiply the numbers as normal, but I bring the negative sign with the answer. Okay, but what if both numbers are negative? We can't use the previous method we just looked at. Not directly. Why? Well, if I have negative 2 times negative 4, I can't say that I have a negative 4 negative 2 times. I can't say I have a negative 2 negative 4 times. I can't count an amount of numbers using a negative number. So what do? Well, first, before we explain what we do, let's remember one important detail we've learned in the past. A negative sign can also mean opposite. So here's some examples. A negative 5 is the same thing as saying the opposite of 5. So when I see a negative sign, I can actually verbally state that as the opposite of that number. So a negative 5 is the opposite of 5. A negative 8 can mean the opposite of 8. So when I see that negative sign, I can literally say it's the opposite of something. So let's remember that first. So we're going to think of it this way. If I have negative 3 times negative 2, we're going to go ahead, like we did earlier, and we're just going to say, well, what is 3 times 2? 3 times 2 is 6. Now I'm just going to bring both of those negative signs with the answer, since they're both negative, and that's going to give me 2 negatives. So 3 times 2 is 6. I'm going to bring both negatives with the answer. Before I did the problem, I had 1 negative, so I brought 1 negative with the answer. This time I'm going to bring both negatives with the answer, which would give me a negative, -6, which seems kind of weird, but remember, a negative sign in the front can be read as the opposite. So basically, when I'm reading negative, -6, I can say it as the opposite of -6. Well, what's the opposite of -6? The opposite of -6 is 6. So therefore, -3 times -2 is +6 because it is the opposite of -6. All right, so let's try some. If I have -5 times -4, I can't really write it out with how many I have, but I can say that I know 5 times 4 is 20, and I know that they're both negative, so I'm going to bring both negative signs. And I put both negative signs over there. But the negative of -20 really means the opposite of a -20. The opposite of a -20 is a +20. Number 2, 8 times 6 is 48. Bring both negatives, and I have the opposite of -48. The opposite of -48 is a +48. Okay, one more. -1 times -7. 1 times 7 is 7. Bring both negatives. I have the opposite of -7 is +7. So notice if you have two negatives and you're multiplying, you basically just go ahead, multiply the two numbers like we previously have in the past, and just bring both negative signs with it. But those both negative signs are basically going to cancel out to give you a positive sign in the end because you're going to have the opposite of a negative. So two negatives multiplied are going to give you a positive. Now, if you're going to do division, you're just going to do follow all the same rules as multiplication. So if I were going to take -10 divided by -2, I'm going to do the same kind of thing, only in reverse. I'm going to say, well, what's 10 divided by 2? 10 divided by 2 is 5. I have two negatives, so I'm going to bring them both. The opposite of -5 is a +5. Or if I have 15, or -15, divided by -3, well, what's 15 divided by 3? It's 5. But I bring both negatives. The opposite of a -5 is a +5. So you go ahead and just do the division, thinking of just the numbers as being positive, and then you bring the negative signs with them. And if you have two negatives, you've got the opposite of a negative.